Well, thank you guys for opening up your doors here in Miami. To me, it's a privilege and an honor to be here with you. I have gotten to not only get to know this church and your pastor, but also this city before really relationship here with you guys and with Eric. My understanding of Miami didn't go as far as Dwayne Wade and Will Smith, so it's good to be able to learn more about the culture here in the incredible city that Miami is, and to be able to continue the relationship and friendship with Eric. I'm sure if you guys are here, then you know the blessing that Eric is to you as a pastor, but in case you do not, let me just make it clear. I don't know if you've been to many churches before or heard many pastors or heard many preachers, but Eric is unique. Eric is gifted. Eric loves Jesus. Eric is an outstanding teacher of the Word. I find that while, yes, we may be a church that's supporting Grace Church here in Miami, I find that our church is often supported by the ministry here. As it feels like anytime there's an issue, I find myself texting, calling, or figuring out a way to come down to Eric to figure out what I should do. So he is an outstanding friend and an outstanding pastor, and it's an honor, again, and a privilege to be able to be here. And so as we come together and open up God's Word to look this evening, Eric opened up the door and said, well, you feel free to preach whatever you want to. I said, well, you want me to preach a Christmas message? It is December. He said, no, don't feel like you have to do that. I said, okay, Eric Grinchcroft, that's fine, but I'm going to do that anyway because it is December. And I'm a Christmas man. The moment that Michael Bublé steps out of his cave, I am hooked and ready for the Christmas season. To put up our tree as early as we need to, all the food and everything else that comes along with it. Hallmark movies, bring it all. I don't care. I'm fine with it. But also the uniqueness of the season in regards to what it means for Christians as we look back and remember the first time that Jesus came to this earth. And also reminding ourselves that there will be another time when He will come again. And so we live kind of in this, in between those two comings, those two arrivals of Jesus. And so that reality has birthed so many great songs for the church to be able to sing. We sang one earlier, Joy to the World, that we sing often. We're going to sing one after the sermon, and so many others. And one of my favorite Christmas songs that the church sings is this song written by this dude named Charles Wesley a couple hundred years ago. And the song is called Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. And it really vocalizes that longing that so many people feel. This world's broken. This world's damaged. And we're longing for Jesus to return again to be able then to deliver us and save us ultimately. And the song, the first few lines go like this: Come thou long expected Jesus, born to set thy people free. From our fears and sins release us. Let us find our rest in thee. Now, in those lyrics here the last month or so, I kind of was looking back at them, and something jumped out that I hadn't quite seen before, especially that third line. From our fears and sins release us. Now, it jumped out to me because I thought, that's an interesting phrase, one I don't normally associate with Christmas, but one that's relevant to all of us. And so I began to ask the question, what does it mean that Jesus came to release us from our fears? I mean, fear is something that we can all relate to. We all have something that we are afraid of. What is it that makes you afraid? Someone asks you, what's your greatest fear? Grab that in your mind right now. We'll pass a microphone around. Let everyone share your greatest fear here in front of everyone. I'm kidding. We're not going to do that. But what is that thing that you are afraid of? What do you fear? And in what ways did Jesus come to release us from fear? Now, not all fear is bad. Right? There is some fear that is innately good. In fact, the Bible tells us that we are to fear God. That there's this kind of reverential awe that we are to have with our Creator. Not to be trembling afraid of Him, but we are to fear the Lord. In other aspects, fear is actually good because it lets us know that there's something dangerous that we are close to. So fear arises within ourselves. I've heard people say it's a wonder that any boy lives to the age of 13 because they need more fear in their lives. My 2-year-old son, I think he is wonderful, but I would love if he had more fear. We've got a retention pond we live next to. It's like a double black diamond cliff down the side of our house. And he just goes and will wander over there. And I'm like, do you not understand what you're about to step into? I wish he was more afraid. So not all fear is bad. So what are the types of fears that Jesus came to release us from? Well, again, we all have something we are afraid of. Fear of growing old, fear of dying, fear of something terrible happening to you or to someone that's close to you. Perhaps the fear of being inconsequential or living an insignificant life. Fear of failing, fear of aging or losing vitality, fear of rejection or abandonment, fear of being hurt or maybe fear of being hurt again. Fear of the future for your children or for the future of our country. Fear of what people think about us, say about us, or how they treat us. I could go on, but the conclusion is simple. We understand what it means to fear something. But one fear in particular I want to highlight here at the beginning is one of the most common fears that humans share, and that is the fear of being exposed. And it actually has a name even within psychology. It's known as Imposter Syndrome, this fear of being exposed as an imposter. Feeling like I'd go to my work, I go to my job, and I'm worried they're going to find out how I'm not any good at this. I'm just an imposter. I'm worried that people will see these parts of me that I try so hard to cover up, and they will find me out to be the imposter that I am. And we all commonly live with this fear that's nagging of being found out or exposed, of not being as smart or as talented or as deserving or as experienced or fill in the blank as people might think that we are. It's a common phenomenon that was coined in the 80s as imposter syndrome. And now researchers believe up to 70% of people have experienced it at some point in their lives. Now, one of the most common nightmares actually affirms this and shares this same theme. Now, sure, there are common shared nightmares of falling through the sky, of running away from somebody that you're being chased from and you're unable to move quick enough and you feel like you're stuck. Or as I was researching, one of the most common nightmares is having your teeth fall out. I didn't know that, but apparently a lot of people do. I don't know if there's a fear of flossing or what that is, but it's a thing. But consistently at the top of nightmare lists is this fear of showing up in public to your work, to school, to come up and give a speech. And when you get there, you realize you have no clothes on. You are completely naked, completely exposed. And researchers believe this actually is directly linked to our innate fear of being exposed and not being able to hide anything. And we fear finding out that people will find out who we really are. We fear not being able to cover up our failures and shortcomings and shame. We fear being exposed. So how does the Bible speak to any of this, and what in the world does it have to do with the birth of Jesus? Well, to answer that question, before we dive into our text tonight, we have to look in the Bible and ask, where did fear even come from? Because when God created the world, He didn't create fear. It wasn't there in the beginning when He created Adam and Eve in the garden. But it didn't take long for fear to show up. In Genesis 3, just a couple pages into the Bible, man ruins everything. God created the world perfectly. He had this perfect relationship with His creation. He lived amongst them, dwelt with them. There was perfect peace. There was no fear. And God told them, you can live here. Here's what you need to do. Just don't eat from that tree. A million things you can do, just don't eat from that tree. Well, what do Adam and Eve do? They go and they eat from that tree. They go and there's this serpent that then tempts them and says, look, here, eat this. It's not that bad. God just doesn't want you to be like Him. And in Genesis 3, verse 6, the woman saw the tree was good for food, delightful to look at, it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. She took some of its fruit and ate it, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. And this is what's known as the fall. This was mankind rebelling against God, this kind of cosmic rebellion, this cosmic mutiny of turning against Him and disobeying Him. And then the very next thing, the very next sentence says this, then the eyes of both of them were opened and they knew they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Why? Because they were ashamed. They could feel they were exposed, and so they tried to cover themselves. Next sentence, the man and his wife heard then the sound of God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees. So the Lord God called out to the man and said, where are you? And Adam responded, well, God, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. So I hid. And in that moment, we see the introduction of fear into the world. And we see the connection that fear has to our sin. That sin generated shame, the shame of feeling exposed, the shame of being found out, the fear then of being exposed before a holy God, the fear of our failures being found out by our Creator. And so that fear of being exposed led Adam and Eve to do two things. They tried to cover themselves with fig leaves, and then they ran and they hid from God. Now listen, I don't know if there's a bunch of fig leaves out in Miami. I'm not familiar with the agriculture here. And so we're not going and sowing fig leaves to try to cover ourselves. But goodness, we try to cover ourselves and our shame with a whole host of other kind of things. Sort of metaphorical fig leaves to try to keep ourselves from being found out. Maybe we try to make fig leaves out of our success in our business or our careers. Maybe try to cover ourselves with confidence or maybe a sense of humor. Maybe we try to cover our shame with just trying to fill our lives with pleasure in this world, with whatever that might be. My goodness, maybe the greatest fig leaf of our time is social media. We try to project this image of what we want people to see and cover up the parts that we don't want people to see. Projecting out this perfect image externally that's not really what life is really like. You don't see Instagram photos of leftover PB&J for dinner. You see these perfectly made meals and lattes with cool little latte art put with an awesome filter. And it's like, man, that's not every day. That's not once a month for us. Like we're making it on pretzels and Cheetos for dinner, but nobody's posting that. We're trying to cover ourselves. And perhaps the most dangerous fig leaf is the fig leaf of religion. That we will go and try to find enough things for us to do to be able to cancel out our shame. Well, maybe if I go to church enough, then I won't be ashamed to stand before God. It will cover my failures. Maybe if I begin to externally live a certain way. Friends, why do you come to church? Why do you say you follow Jesus? And are you just sowing fig leaves, hoping that people won't see through the facade of what you fashioned together? We, like Adam and Eve, try to cover ourselves with whatever we can find. But also we do, like Adam and Eve did also, as they ran from God and they hid. They were afraid of God because their sin, they felt exposed, and they were worried about stepping into then this presence of a holy God. So they ran from Him. They didn't want to be near Him because they were worried about what would happen. And so for us, do we fear what God will think? Do you fear that if you get close to Him, what it is He might do? Because sometimes underneath, we might think that His acceptance of us, or God's approval of us, is based on our performance for Him. And so if that is the origin of fear, and in particular our fear of being exposed and being found out as an imposter, then how does Jesus address this fear and ultimately release us from it? And it's there I want us to turn to Hebrews 4, verses 12 through 16. And we'll just spend a few minutes walking through this verse to see how it answers that question and what Jesus did. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. If you're unfamiliar with the Bible, the chapter numbers are the larger numbers. The verse numbers are the smaller numbers. We'll be in chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. If you don't have a Bible, there are Bibles out in the lobby at the Welcome Center table. Feel free to go and grab one of those. They are free, and I know that Grace loves to give Bibles away. So go grab one, take it home with you. That'll be their gift to you, and they'll be glad to give it to you. But tonight, we'll be in Hebrews 4, verses 12 through 16. So I want to read it in its entirety, and then we'll just spend a few minutes walking through it. So verse 12, author of Hebrews writes this: "For the word of God is living and effective, and sharper than any double-edged sword, penetrating as far as the separation of soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It is able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And no creature is hidden from Him, but all things are naked and exposed to the eyes of Him to whom we must give an account. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. So what did Jesus do 2,000 years ago when he was born to release us from our fears? This fear that's connected to our sin of being exposed and standing in the very presence of God. Well, we see in verses 12 and 13, the author deals directly with this fear of being exposed. Right, verse 12, he writes, the word of God is living and effective, sharper than any double-edged sword, penetrating as far as the separation of soul and spirit, joints and marrow. Now, if you have any history with the church or you grew up in the church, you probably heard this verse quoted. And it's often used directly referencing the power of the Bible, the power of the Scriptures. It's alive, it's active, it penetrates, it separates our thoughts and our intentions. Right, I was recently given by someone in our church a couple fish. They have a brother who fishes offshore. He brought in some fish to them. They brought it to me and gave it to me in a bag. A whole fish together, heads, everything. Handed it to me. So I went home. You can't cook it that way. You have to clean it. Well, I don't have any kind of cleaning knife. I don't have any kind of sharp knife to be able to do the job. So I grabbed what I could find, but I was having a hard time penetrating the scales of the fish. So I had to hack at the scales, trying to get it out of the way, get it up, trying to separate the meat from the bones. And I'm leaving so much on there because my knife isn't sharp. It's not able to penetrate and it's not able to separate. But what Hebrews 4:12 is saying is that God's word is sharp. It's sharper than my knife. It's sharper than one of the knives you see late at night that can cut through your shoe or a penny, which I don't know why knives would need to be able to do that, but apparently they can. But God's word is sharper than any double-edged sword or any boning knife and penetrates to the very heart of who we are, separating our joints and marrow, and can judge the thoughts and intentions of our hearts. And usually the verse ends there. But that's not the point of what the author here is trying to get the reader to see. It's not what he's trying to get us to see. The point is not only the power of the sword, but the effect of that sword. And that's what we see in verse 13. This is what happens then when God's word does its job. Then no creature is hidden from God, but all things are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. That God's word separates the very underneath parts of who we are, not only what we do, but why we do what we do. That God sees everything. That God knows everything. That there is nothing that you can hide from him. And boy, if this chapter ended there, that's a terrifying reality. Because here's what it says. It says that God knows more about your shame than you do. It says that he is more familiar with your failure than you are, and he is more closely acquainted with your sin than you, that there is nothing is hidden from him, even if you're able to hide it from others, or even if you're able to hide it from yourself. It is not hidden from him. And so here we are at the end of verse 13, just like Adam and Eve in the garden, our sin and our shame is then exposed. We stand naked before our Creator, and in fear, we have the same tendency that Adam and Eve have. We want to run, we want to cover ourselves up, we want to distance ourselves from God and hide. But just like in the garden, God doesn't wait for us to get ourselves together and come to him. He came to us. God went to the garden and called out for Adam and Eve. And 2,000 years ago, God came for us. And what did he do when he arrived? What was it that Jesus did as he lived then? Well, that's what we see in verse 14. It tells us that he came as a high priest. Verse 14 says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, well, who is that high priest? Was this man named Jesus. Jesus, who was the very Son of God. Now that profession of being a high priest is one that most of us are probably not familiar with. And so there may be the tendency to want to look around for a modern vocation to say, well, Jesus is our basketball coach. Jesus is our defense attorney, and maybe try to help us understand. But God chose to describe Jesus and give him this particular office as a high priest for a reason. And so rather than discarding that and replacing with something modern, we have to do a little bit of work to go back to the Old Testament to see what a high priest did and why verse 14 is significant and how it connects to our sin. You see, we cannot unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament. We need it. And we cannot impose some kind of modern occupation to try to explain it away. God gave us centuries of stories and images and systems so that we could have a better understanding of who Jesus is and what he came to do. And so here in Genesis 3, as we were reading, sin entered the world. The relationship between man and God was then fractured. Death and sin and brokenness entered into this world. And then we see in the Garden of Eden that people are removed from God's presence and God has to leave. And honestly, the rest of the Bible is God's plan to move back into the neighborhood that we've ruined and ultimately to restore it. That's why in Christmas, Jesus has given this particular name of Emmanuel, because God is with us. But there is still a problem we haven't answered from Genesis 3. And that is this: how can a holy God, perfect without sin, dwell with and in and amongst a sinful people that have rejected him? Because our sin calls out for condemnation. Our sin deserves punishment. And there may be the tendency to think, well, okay, that maybe, Caleb, I hear you, and that might be true, but I don't sin that badly. Right? There are a lot worse people out there. You tell me my sin deserves an eternal punishment of God's wrath separated from him in hell? How is that fair? Well, I tell this story, but I remember a number of years ago of this couple in Washington, D.C. that somehow was able to sneak in and crash this party where the President of the United States was. They somehow got past Secret Service. They got past all security check-ins. They took a picture with Barack Obama as he was president. These people weren't on the guest list. Well, later it comes to find out that they weren't invited, and they were then banned from the District of Columbia. They couldn't come into the city. Listen, I don't know if you've ever showed up at a party uninvited. I have, and I wasn't banned from that city. So what was the difference? It was the same action. The difference is not what it is that we did. The difference is who we did it against. And when they did that against the most powerful person in the United States, there were greater repercussions than whenever I did it in college to somebody who just forgot to invite me to the party. And friends, for us, we may look around and compare what we do to others and go, oh, it's not that bad what I'm doing. And let me just ask you to change the question and say, who is it I'm doing this against? And if in our sin, our rebellion, as we choose things away from God, we are then acting in defiance of a holy and just and eternal God, then perhaps we do deserve a holy and just and eternal punishment. So how then can God dwell with these people who deserve that kind of punishment? Our sin has to be dealt with for God to dwell in and amongst us. Well, that's why God then gives us in the Old Testament this book of Leviticus, the book of his law that introduced a number of things, including the sacrificial system. Goodness, have you ever tried to read through the Bible? You get to Leviticus and it's like, oh man, I'm just going to skip to 3 John. Like this is a lot. What does this have to do with me? Well, here's the point. The point was for God to be able to show his people what they needed to do for him to dwell again with his people. The apex of the book of Leviticus is in chapter 16, in this day called the Day of Atonement, where the people's sin against God had to be atoned so that they could have a relationship again with God. Now that word atonement, it pretty much just means to make at one meant, to reconcile, to bring back together. And on this day, the high priest of Israel, who acted as a mediator between the sinful people and a holy God, would then stand, in essence, in the gap between these people and their God, and would on that day go through a number of rituals, make sure he was ceremonial clean. That on that day then would walk into the temple, and in the temple there was this one room where God's presence dwelt in particular. It's called the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. And it had this veil, it had this curtain that separated that room from the rest of the world. Why? Because that room was too holy for a sinful people to walk into. If they walked in, they would die in a heartbeat. They would tie a rope around the high priest's ankles that when he went in there, in case he dropped dead, no one would go in after him. They could just drag him out. And so the high priest would make sure, ceremonially clean, would then walk into, on this one day, after a number of rituals, would walk into this room with a sacrifice of blood of bulls and goats that were killed, and then go and sprinkle that blood on the mercy seat to be able to show that there was then this atonement that was made and God could continue to dwell with these people. And God was wanting to teach his people about what sin was and how serious it was. He wanted them to understand the consequences of sin are serious. It requires death. But he also wanted them to see there was a way for those consequences and that punishment to be transferred to another and for them to die in your place. But the last thing that he wanted them to see is that the sacrifice of animals weren't good enough. They had to do it every year. They couldn't remove the problem. And so this yearly sacrifice made an atonement for people's sins and made it possible again for God to dwell with them. That's the point, God making a way to be able to dwell with his people. And that presence, that relationship is mediated by this one man who was appointed as high priest. He acted as that mediator to reconcile that relationship. So when Jesus was born 2,000 years ago, one of the things he came to be was our high priest, to act as the mediator between a holy God and a sinful people. 1 Timothy 2:5 says there's one God and one mediator between God and mankind. It's the man, Christ Jesus. He was to stand in the gap of separation between our fear, between our sins, and between a relationship with a holy God. And he would walk into the very presence of God with a sacrifice that would atone for our sin, that our punishment would be laid on another, and that we could be reconciled back into a relationship with God. That's why in verse 14 it says that he passed through the heavens to show that God, Jesus, as our high priest, went into the presence of God with this sacrifice. But what is extraordinary about Jesus is that he was not only the high priest, he was also the sacrifice. It wasn't a bull or a goat or a lamb that he offered himself. It was the Lamb of God that died in our place for our sin, and his blood was shed on the cross to deal with our sins and our fears once and for all. It wasn't a sacrifice that needed to happen again and again. He is our great high priest, and he is our final high priest. The sacrifice happened once on the cross, and it won't have to happen again. Why in Hebrews 10, the author says, every priest stands day after day, ministering and offering the same sacrifices time after time, which can never take away sins. But this man, Jesus Christ, after offering one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. And now, where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer an offering for sin. What the author is getting us to see is that since Jesus handled that sacrifice for us, we don't have to keep going back trying to make up for our sin, trying to make up for our failures. Jesus handled that for us in our place. So what does that mean for you? Well, if you believe and trust and follow Jesus, it means that all of your sin, it means that all of your shame, it means that all of the condemnation, all of the fear that you're working so hard to cover has actually been removed from you, transferred to another, and dealt with once and for all. It means that you are forgiven. You don't have to bring him anything. Friends, you don't have to pay for something that's already been purchased. You don't have to cover something that's already been removed. God sees all of it. He sees through the fig leaves. He sees through the facade. But in Christ, in this great high priest, you are forgiven. So the truth of verse 14 actually makes verses 12 and 13, instead of being condemning and frightening, incredibly freeing. Because here's what it says, is that God sees everything you've ever done. There's nothing that he will discover that will make him go, oh, maybe we should rethink our arrangement. God has seen all of it. And he loves you, and he accepts you, and he's died on the cross for you if you would turn and trust in him. So there is security in that relationship, because there is nothing that will pop up that will make him go, oh, I didn't see that coming. There is nothing hidden from him, and he has dealt with all of it. Jesus is our great and final high priest, and he has now made a way for us to enter into the presence of God. We've been fully reconciled to him and have access to him. We can now approach him. That's why it's so significant when Jesus died. Do you know what Matthew, one of the writers of the Gospels in the New Testament, in his Gospel, do you know what Matthew notes as the first thing that happened after Jesus breathed his last breath and gave up his spirit? Matthew notes this in Matthew 27:51. Suddenly, the curtain of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. Doesn't that seem like a strange detail to add right after Jesus, the Son of God, has died? But here's why it is significant. Matthew is trying to get across to the readers that would have understood what that curtain and veil represented. It represented the separation from people being able to enter into God's presence. That was the curtain there in the Holy of Holies that separated people from entering into the presence of God. And Matthew is saying, now that this great high priest has come and offered this sacrifice once and for all, reconciling us back into a relationship with him, that curtain that separated us is now torn apart, and we can then enter into that throne room. We can enter into his presence. We can now approach God. And so whenever we couldn't get to him, he came to us and made a way for us to be reconciled to him by dealing with our sin once and for all. And there is the confidence of our confession, the assurance of our acceptance, and the promise of our pardon. It's not in how good you are. It's not in how impressive you feel like your life may be as you try to get things together and go offer it to God. Say, God, can I approach you now? Like, look what I've done for you. No, the confidence to approach him lies in his faithfulness, not in our own. Hebrews 10:23, the author writes this: let us hold on to the confession of our hope without wavering. Confidently holding on to the confession of our hope. Why? Since he who promised is faithful. Not because you're faithful. Not because you're impressive, because Jesus is faithful, and he's died in your place. He's paid the price of your sin, and all the punishment that was meant for you was poured out on him if you believe in him. And so you can then boldly approach the throne of grace. Friends, the assurance of your acceptance isn't based on your performance, but on his faithfulness to cover us. Man, we're no different from Adam and Eve. Because if you remember in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve didn't walk out of the garden wearing fig leaves. They were wearing something else. Genesis 3:21 adds this note, that the Lord God made clothing from skins for the man and his wife, and God clothed them. God took the fig leaves that they made to try to cover themselves, threw them away, made skins for them. Now listen, I'm no hunter, but in order to make skins, I'm pretty sure an animal has to die. And here in Genesis 3, we see the very first sacrifice. They were covered by God through the death of another in their place. Friends, it is no different with us. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says that he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. Our sin, all those who believe and trust in Jesus, our sin is then placed on Jesus in our place. The one who knew no sin became sin. Why? So that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Our sin picked up and transferred onto Jesus on the cross. The wrath of God and punishment for our sin unleashed onto him. And Jesus' righteousness is then given to us. His perfect obedience is transferred into our account. He is our great high priest, and he has paid the way. And so you can quit hiding. You can quit running. You can quit being afraid of being exposed before God, because he's seen it all and he loves you. And he's dealt with that shame and sin and condemnation once and for all, and covered you in the robes of righteousness of Jesus Christ and brought you into his family. Paul writes this in Romans 8:14. He says, "You did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. No, but you've received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry, Abba, Father." Our identity has shifted, and we are now children of the King, adopted into his family. So friends, this Christmas, don't fall back into the fear of your sin. Live as a child of your King. That's the identity you have now. And we worship a God who is mighty to save. Now looking at 15, the text could end there, and we could say amen and go right into some kind of worship song, because it's unbelievable that Jesus was our high priest. But the text doesn't end there. We look on and see, because the beauty of Jesus doesn't end there in verse 15. We see we do not have a high priest then who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who's been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. So friends, we see that we worship a God who's not only mighty to save, but a God who is mighty to feel. Not only a great high priest, but a sympathetic high priest. Why? Because the way that God dealt with the brokenness of his creation was by stepping into the brokenness of his creation. He was truly God, yes, but Jesus was truly man. He lived. He was tired. He was hungry. He had to have his diaper changed. He was hurt. He was despondent. He was betrayed. He was gossiped about. He was tempted. He was beaten. He was mocked. He was murdered. This is God that we're talking about, that experienced this. So friends, whatever you're walking through this Christmas season, whatever pain, whatever temptation, whatever struggle, know this: Jesus is no stranger to your weakness. When I'm walking down the street and I see a dad who's got a little girl, maybe 3, 4 years old, and I hear that child singing this song, "Let It Go." There is an immense amount of sympathy I feel for that father, because I too have a 4-year-old girl that loves Queen Elsa and sings that song all the time. You say, "Caleb, that movie came out years ago." Exactly. It's been years of that song. And there is a unique sympathy I have for that father, because I've walked the road that he's walking now. In a much more serious way, my father passed away 8 years ago of a heart attack as he was mowing the front yard. It was out of nowhere. It was healthy, and in a moment he was gone. There's a unique sympathy in my heart whenever I hear someone who loses a parent. Why? Because I've walked through it. We're still walking through it. And in that sympathy, your heart breaks in a particular way because you felt what they are feeling. Friends, what we see in verse 15 is that God's heart breaks in a particular way for you, in your weakness, because he's felt what you are feeling. But he didn't give in to temptation. And so maybe there's this image of your mind about who God is, right, that maybe keeps you from coming to him. Maybe this image has this picture of God being like a parent who's tapping their foot and furrowing their eyebrows as their child is past curfew. And as the child walks back in, you kind of picture God as that parent in the living room with one lamp on, the rest of the lights off, I guess for ominous effect or whatever else. And you walk in and the parent looks at the child and says, "Where have you been and what are you thinking?" And maybe you think God would respond the same way. Foot tapping, eyebrows furrowing, frustrated with you. Friends, that's not what we find in the Bible. Well, how? How does God not respond that way? Because all those that come back to him, the judgment has already been taken care of. The condemnation has already been unleashed. That's the point of verse 14. The punishment of your sin was poured out on another in your place. It truly is finished. There isn't anything left. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And now Jesus knows the brokenness and weakness you're walking through because he walked through it as well. And he walked through it perfectly. And so what we see in his first coming is that Jesus tasted our sadness. And the hope that we have as Christians is that in his second coming, he will come to end our sadness. And while we wait for and long for that day, we can have the confidence to know we have a high priest seated at the right hand of God, not looking down with frustration, but with sympathy. His foot is not tapping, his heart is breaking. And so with all of that being true, what then is our response? How do we respond to the realities then of us standing exposed before God, of God taking care of our sin and sending Jesus as our great high priest and having this high priest who's sympathetic to our weaknesses? How then do we respond? Well, that's what verse 16 then tells us, therefore. That word is an important word in the Bible. Anytime you see it, you have to ask, what is it there for? It's connecting something to what has just come from. So the writer is saying, everything I've just written leads then to this conclusion. Therefore, here's now what we are to do. Let us approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. The conclusion to all those truths about who God is and what He's done for us leads us to be able then to approach God's throne, enter into His presence, not with fear and trepidation, but with boldness, not in confidence of what we have done. Boldness enters the picture because Jesus has entered the picture. Goodness, I wish I could go back to the Old Testament and sit down and talk to a high priest or talk to Moses and have a conversation with him and say, hey, listen, Moses, what if I told you you had to approach God's throne in the most holy place? How would you do it? How would they respond? I can only imagine they would respond and say, well, if I have to do it, I wouldn't want to because I know if I did it, I would die. But if I had to, I would walk slowly towards that curtain with fear, trembling as I knew what was about to happen to me because of my sin as I entered into God's presence. Boy, and then I'd love to let them read Hebrews 4, 12 through 16 and say, because of this great high priest who's dealt with our sin once and for all, who sits sympathetically in his seat as he deals with us, we then can now boldly approach the throne of grace because we're now his children. Right? Think about it. Who can go and bother a king of a country for a glass of water in the middle of the night? Their children can. And friends, that's the access that we now have to God for all those who have trusted in Him. We are now His children and have a different identity. So goodness, this is so practical for us because verse 16 tells us where to go when we need help. We can boldly approach the throne of grace so that, here's what you will find when you get there. You will receive mercy and you will find grace. So when you go, you won't find judgment, you won't find condemnation, you will receive mercy and you will find grace. And what will those things do? Well, they will come to help us in our time of need. Part of what that verse is implying is that you're going to need help. There will be difficulty, there will be struggle, there will be brokenness, and there will be fear. And so we see then in verse 16, it helps us see when we are afraid, where do we go? When something happens that shakes us, where do we go? We go to the very throne of God because there we know we'll find the grace and receive the mercy that we need. So if you're afraid that you can't walk through the pain that this holiday season stirs in you, friends, run to the throne of grace and you will find a sympathetic Savior that has felt the suffering of this broken world and is crying with you. But will also remind you of His promise to come again and wipe every tear from the face of His children. Are you afraid of the uncertainty of the future, fearing that at any turn your life might unravel or might already be unraveling? Run to the throne of grace and you will find a sovereign King that holds all of your tomorrows in His hands, who loves you more than you can imagine and has a plan for your life, for your good and for His glory. Are you gripped by what people think of you, crippled by fearing what people are viewing you as? Run to the throne of grace and you will find a Father. You will find your Creator who loves you and accepts you without conditions and who has fixed your identity not on what you can do or what the sum of your past mistakes are or what people think of you, but on who He says you are. And He says that you are His child, a child of the King. And so the takeaway of this text isn't to never be afraid. When we see that Jesus came to release us from our fears, we don't then walk away and go, well, I'm just never going to be afraid. We're humans. We will fear. No, the takeaway of this text is to ask the question what we do when we're afraid and where we go when we are afraid. It's an invitation to echo Psalm 56:3. When I am afraid, I will trust in you. It means that we run to him when we want to run from him. It means that we cry out for mercy and grace when we want to fix ourselves. It means that when we find ourselves trembling, we will choose to trust. Jesus was born nearly 2,000 years ago to be able to offer us the hope of Hebrews 4:16. He came to release us from our fears and our sins by making a way to enter into the presence of God and find the help that we need. And one day he will come again and carry us into his perfect presence for eternity. And in that perfect love, fear will be cast out forever. And so we pray, amen. Come, Lord Jesus.